Steve Jones found himself seated on the back porch, absorbed in the spectacle of the sun dipping below the sea, musing over the possibility that relocating here years before might have been a good idea. The allure and tranquility of this spot were undeniable. The here in question was a small island situated off the northern shores of Cornwall. Throughout their 22-year union, Steve's spouse, Claire, gently prodded, persuaded, and ultimately succeeded in convincing him to make the move from London to this location, a place her family and ancestors had called home for generations. The advent of improved communication and technological advancements, coupled with the shifts brought on by the COVID pandemic, made it feasible for him to telecommute effectively, reducing his need to visit the capital to merely once every month. During their time in London, Claire often made trips to the island to be with her family and friends, and importantly, to visit her mother. They took ownership of their home from one of Claire's relatives 2 years ago, but only made the move 6 months ago. Claire utilized these visits to manage renovations, using the residence as a staging area once the major refurbishments were completed. Positioned with its back towards the western bay, their home offered stunning sunset vistas, which Steve relished over a cool beer. This property, once a farm, was nestled amidst fields and orchards, now featuring what appeared to be a number of newly planted trees, likely Claire's effort in the previous spring to enhance the landscape. Orchards and trees were a familiar sight around the island, leading Steve to wonder if they served to protect against the strong sea breezes or, more plausibly, for the production of the region's esteemed cider. Admitting the move was a judicious choice was inevitable for him. Claire had been right. The pace of life here was distinct, marked by close-knit communities, a significant number of whom were Claire's relatives. For Claire, returning was a joy, being acquainted with everyone on the island. As someone new, Steve felt a mild distance from the inhabitants, yet he valued their straightforward nature. The solidarity among the community members impressed him, possibly mirroring the independence a small island community must sustain. Steve and Claire's paths crossed in college, where they were both business majors, Claire focusing on marketing, while Steve delved into new technologies. They quickly developed a deep connection, marrying shortly after their studies and opting for London due to the better job opportunities it offered. After 2 decades of marriage, Claire's beauty still struck Steve. Over the years, her hair had become shorter, now styled to fall just above her shoulders, with a golden hue highlighting her blonde strands. Despite her slight concern over gaining a bit of weight, he found it only served to enhance her figure, making her curves, particularly around her hips and chest, more prominent. Her eyes remained a captivating blend of blue and grey, dotted with specks of yellow. Unlike Steve, she always appeared impeccably put together, never in disarray, maintaining an ageless elegance. Never had he seen her as happy and immersed in the community as now, taking an active role in various local activities. Her most recent project was the coordination of a solstice festival. Their twin daughters, Nicole and Michelle, who arrived soon after the couple wed, were currently at Durham University, a change that further propelled Steve and Claire to relocate. According to their social media updates, the girls seemed to be fully enjoying their time at university, although Steve trusted they were handling their studies well, despite Nicole's habit of putting things off. Steve's fascination with the island's history drew him to the local tavern, where he would listen to stories of past fishing exploits. He found several old volumes detailing the island's lore in a small building serving as both a library and a meeting spot for the community. Venturing into his house's attic for the first time, he was eager to learn more about the island's past. Amidst the assortment of old beds, furnishings, and toys, he sought out traces of history. During his search, he uncovered an old box containing a manuscript titled Tales from the Island, authored by Melissa Taylor, a surname he recognized as his wife's. Settling on a woven stool, he began to read through the document. The handwriting was beautiful, characterized by an ornate script embellished with flourishes and decorative touches. The document wove together stories and personal reflections passed down through generations. As Steve flipped through the pages, illustrations of trees caught his attention, further engaging his curiosity. His eyes momentarily swept over the material. Certain sections were poorly lit and hard to make out, yet he was able to catch bits and pieces. The practice began in 1287 during the reign of the Plantagenet kings, with the enforcement of the jus primae noctis, or right of the first night, as part of the wedding agreement. This allowed the sovereign lord the right to spend the first night with any new bride within his domain. Steve remembered a reference to this in a movie starring Mel Gibson as William Wallace, but he believed it to be a myth used by Hollywood to add some intrigue and excitement to the film's plot. Steve read on about the deep distress this custom caused the bridegroom, and, to prevent any plots of revengeful murder, the tradition was adapted so that an older woman would spend a night with the bridegroom. This eventually changed into a practice where a senior female would share the bed with the bridegroom to offer a semblance of equilibrium to the couple. The country suffered from the plague for more than 250 years, severely reducing its population. The island also experienced significant loss of life during a harsh epidemic in 1622. The fear that the island's population might reduce to unsustainable levels was real, prompting serious considerations of abandoning the island. Later, tales started circulating about partner swapping on April Fool's Day as a strategy to repopulate the island, encouraging widows to seek out younger partners. With the outbreak of the First World War, almost all the island's males enlisted in the British Army, many of whom never returned, leading to changes in local traditions to provide young, single men with alternate companions before enlistment. This custom saw a slight resurgence during the Second World War. The story then details Melissa's personal observations in the 1950s, highlighting how the introduction of outsiders and the displacement of local people weakened the tradition, though it lingered within some family circles. The senior members of the community affirmed the tradition's importance and resilience. Married women who have raised children provide company to young men as they reach 18, easing the pressure and worry associated with their inaugural sexual experiences. They also receive guidance from an experienced woman, ultimately becoming better husbands. Divorces are uncommon on the island, and this practice has further reduced the incidence of teenage pregnancies. For the women, it's seen as a community responsibility and a nod to their nurturing contributions. This practice also diminished the effects of empty nest syndrome and the likelihood of affairs outside of marriage. Melissa recounted her own story of offering company to an esteemed young man at 18, while she was 46 and her husband was absorbed in his work. A young man named Robert was working on their small farm, planting trees as a gesture of renewal during a celebration. His compensation was a place in Melissa's matrimonial bed. It implies Melissa's husband knew of the situation but chose to stay quiet. She described how Robert went from being a shy teenager to a self-assured man. Their first meeting was short and awkward, but Melissa welcomed him with warmth, gradually building a close connection. His confidence and skill grew. Their bond was not just physical, she shared her hopes and feelings with him, teaching him crucial aspects of maintaining a successful marriage. Steve marveled at the extraordinary story, questioning its veracity. He could understand some of the historical references, but the whole narrative seemed far-fetched. It could be the author's imagination or a tactic to give her novel, set to be published in a few months, more credibility. Steve was contemplating when he should head back to the city for work. Claire had a long list of items she wanted him to buy, so he decided it would be prudent to extend his stay by a day, and another to reconnect with old friends. If he left after the festival, he could be home by the next Saturday. Claire was delighted, likely because Steve would be around to help with the festival preparations and that he had agreed to do her shopping. The festival day involved the entire island, focusing on children's activities and sports, with plans for dancing and drinks for the adults in the evening. As the evening celebrations began, Steve got to meet some island residents he hadn't encountered before, including John Fraser, his wife Angela, and their son Jake, who Steve thought was about the same age as his youngest daughter. Jake Fraser offered him a rather formal handshake, which was slightly unusual, but any awkwardness quickly dissipated. Together with the tailor, the Frasers positioned themselves as one of the most prominent families on the island. During moments when Claire and the Frasers engaged in nostalgic conversations about familial ties, Steve once again felt like an outsider. That same evening, Steve noticed a cluster of young men glancing in Claire's direction. He found no reason to blame them. Claire was indeed stunning in her chosen summer attire, which accentuated her generous bust and shapely legs. The continuous gazing began to irk Steve, pushing him close to intervening. However, it was Claire's mother who stepped in before he could, leading them swiftly back to the apple cider pub. Steve quietly amused himself with the thought that Claire's mother, Diana, must have seemed daunting to them. Indeed, he couldn't judge them harshly. Diana held a commanding presence as the chairwoman of the Council of Elders. It was clear to Steve that Claire inherited her charm from Diana Taylor, who bore more resemblance to an older sister of Claire than her mother. He resumed, watching the dance, noting its inclusivity across various ages. Despite feeling the effects of the cider, Steve decided he was up for more. The shared jovial mood was palpable, yet it felt like forever waiting to get served. Upon his return, Claire was nowhere to be found, prompting him to look for her. Surprisingly, he discovered her at a table deep in conversation with Jake Fraser, who excused himself upon Steve's approach. "What's happening here?" Steve asked. "Jake has shown an interest in undertaking some gardening projects. I was inquiring about what needs doing and the costs involved. Do we have any gardening needs?" "Indeed, and it's customary to plant and refresh trees around the festival season, which sounds perfect." The conversation about trees jogged Steve's memory of a document he had perused a few days earlier. "So Jake will be planting trees, that's the plan, starting next week." Claire looked at Steve, concerned. "Are you okay? You seem perturbed." Steve answered hesitantly. "What compensation will Jake get in return?" "Clearly money, but we haven't agreed on a figure." "Would you consider offering anything else as a trade for his efforts?" "What are you suggesting?" Steve pressed on. "This isn't related to any island traditions," Claire retorted sharply. "Which traditions?" "You're well aware of the solstice customs. Are you insinuating I intend to sleep with Jake Fraser during your absence next week?" Claire, upset, started crying and left hastily. Steve remained shocked. Damn, what if my accusation towards Claire was baseless? Regret washed over him for. Having consumed too much alcohol, his thoughts were scrambled, making it hard to think straight. He began his walk along the narrow trail towards their house, seeking clarity. This journey felt like the longest he had ever taken. Perhaps he had misunderstood something, or possibly he had overreacted. Upon reaching home, Claire was not there. He slumped onto the sofa, drained from the alcohol and fatigue, and fell asleep. The following morning, he awoke to find Claire still absent and speculated she might have spent the night with the man she was rumored to be with, yet he considered the possibility she was at her mother's. This was confirmed when Claire and Diana arrived at the doorstep. Diana led the conversation, speaking on standing firm, and launched into a tirade against Steve. The deluge of words was hard to follow, but the message was unmistakable. How could he have spoken to Claire that way? How could he distress her so? Marrying someone from outside their community never leads to anything good. He was always going to be seen as unsuitable for her, and the conversation took a familiar downturn. He watched Diana speak, noticing Claire's tearful eyes. Eventually, overwhelmed, he raised his hand, asking them to stop. "I need to ask plainly. Is this a tradition? And do you plan to sleep with Jake Fraser next week?" Claire looked resigned as she turned to her mother, and everything became clear to Steve. "Yes, Steve, some of the ancient families still follow this tradition, or at least aspects of it. The Frasers have requested this agreement, and we are bound to respect it. I've encouraged Claire to consider it. It encompasses all elements of a young man coming of age. The aspect of intimacy is purely educational here, focusing on teaching respect for women. This does not represent intimacy in the way you understand it, nor is it a mere affair. Rather, it's a deep-rooted tradition that has sustained the island during difficult times. It serves as an essential function for the welfare of our community. We see no instances of youth rebellion, no divorces, but rather happy unions and close family bonds. Surely you've noticed this for yourself, Steve." With a sigh, Steve replied, "So it's all true. Wives are engaging with younger men for the greater good of all." Diana responded sharply, "Your words are coarse. As an outsider, you lack the comprehension of its importance to us. It's a recurring theme in the stories we're raised on. Were you one of us by the age of 18, you'd experience its advantages, and it would shape you into a better man. I assume." "You wouldn't reject such an offer," Steve argued back, "yet now there are no ancient laws, no plagues, no wars necessitating this. You continue because it brings you joy. Diana, how many times have you played this role?" A captivating woman like you must have been called upon numerous times for this agreement. I gather you've relished in this for quite some time. Eventually, Diana found herself at a loss for words, but then managed to articulate, "Yes, I fulfilled my obligation several times and am proud of it, just as you should be of Claire's dedication. I urge you, Steve, to let Claire proceed. The importance of this to us is beyond your understanding." Steve turned to his wife. "Is this what you desire? I think I'm ready to accept this responsibility as mentioned by my mother. I wish to become part of this community. My departure for university, getting married, not coming back, and neglecting the responsibilities that others embraced did not sit well with everyone." Steve commented, "So this is deemed a sacrifice. You're engaging in this willingly. Curious, given your excitement about my London trip. You appeared so keen." Claire blushed and explained, "I was simply glad I could arrange everything so it wouldn't involve you. And it won't affect us, I'm sure of it. Nothing will change in our relationship, except for my involvement with another, while it's known to others and you're kept in the dark." "Perhaps you're right," Claire admitted. Steve's sarcastic tone caused Claire and Diana to startle. Then Diana suggested, "Let's give ourselves a moment to calm down and discuss everything in detail, now that it's all out there, as it should be, and nothing has transpired yet." Claire stayed at their home, but their dialogues were scarce. Steve couldn't understand Claire's firm intention to adhere to the island's custom, despite the risk it posed to their connection. Claire maintained that honesty would heal their relationship, promising to be transparent with Steve, even if it meant facing tough conversations. Steve was slightly amazed by her strong faith and belief that such an agreement would not affect their relationship. Diana visited again on Wednesday while Claire was in the village, and he sensed they had arranged a meeting among themselves. "May we talk?" Steve motioned towards the kitchen table, where they sat down. "First off, I need to apologize. This situation shouldn't have happened, and it's my mistake, not Claire's." Steve replied, "Claire has the autonomy to make her decisions, and this decision has been made irrespective of my view. She loves you deeply and thinks our relationship is resilient enough to endure this." Steve's response was tinged with sadness. "In truth, neither of you grasp the depth of how this affects me. It feels like a deep betrayal. At 18, I wasn't here, and unlike the rest, I didn't live with the knowledge that this could happen to my partner. I naively believed my spouse would stay faithful to me as we vowed upon marriage. I understand, Steve, and it must be incredibly difficult to express how our views differ. We don't see it as betrayal. This matter is of utmost importance to us, and I realize that KLA sees it as an opportunity to reconnect with the island community after being away for some time." Diana continued, "What will your response be if she goes through with this?" Steve took a deep breath, hesitant to share his feelings but eventually did. "I cannot come to terms with this," he confessed. After some thought, Diana proposed, "What if we could find a way to equalize things, maybe giving you an opportunity to catch up on what you missed at 18? Steve looked puzzled as Diana elaborated, "I've talked with a couple of other elders. We agree that the elders might offer you a deal similar to what KLA is experiencing." Suddenly, it clicked for Steve. "Are you suggesting I engage with Helen Brown or Moira Fraser?" He remembered encountering both women. Helen, a young widow, appeared to be about his wife's age, with long black hair and dark brown eyes. She was well-maintained, undeniably attractive. Moira Fraser, on the other hand, was not as well known to him. 1929, however, he knew she was happily married and related to the Fraser clan. She serves as the head of a small school, with her hair being a blend of red and blonde curls. Her physique was more refined, often accentuated by her ample cleavage. As Steve pondered these thoughts, he looked up. "Yes, Steve, the seniors are ready to present this, and we hope it conveys to you our seriousness about the matter. We didn't enter into KLA's situation without careful consideration, despite its obvious enticements." Steve regarded the proposal as absurd. "Diana, you are an incredible person and an elder as well." 2005, do you count as a choice too? He asked, unsure whether Diana was serious. Diana hesitated, questioning if Steve was sincere. "If that's necessary for you, Steve, then yes, I agree. I refuse to be held responsible for breaking ancient traditions." Steve was taken aback by Diana's readiness, worried about how he'd justify this arrangement to his dad and the officials. "You know, Diana, some traditions should remain in history, meant to disappear." Diana's smile faded. "Our offer stands, Steve, and you will not be disappointed. That's our guarantee. Think it over." When Steve recounted the story to Kelly, she already knew of the elder's proposal, but Diana's involvement surprised her, leaving her emotional. "I couldn't imagine her considering this. It's too much. I won't be a part of it, Steve. This has to stop." Steve felt relieved, finally recognizing the strangeness of the whole affair. "I'm so glad. I was afraid this could be too much," Kelly sobbed, spending a large part of the night apologizing and reaffirming her affection for Steve. The tension and uncertainty persisted, with Steve wrestling with Kelly's previous willingness and her belief in the proposition's fairness. On Friday, Diana returned, clearly upset by Kelly's change of heart, accusing Steve of being a deceitful foreigner who couldn't understand. Fed up with the grievances, Steve countered, "Why not just admit, Diana, that this is simply a scheme to mock your husband?" Diana was caught off guard. "Fine, if you really want to know, we're having the time of our lives, having a capable young man at our disposal is a dream realized. We spoil them ceaselessly, and it benefits every Fraser." "Can you grasp that?" Kelly moaned. "Mom, please, you're destroying everything." Steve, though, chuckled. "No, let her speak. This is the most honest." She's been attempting to reply. Diana was cut off by Kelly, who asked her to leave until she could see eye to eye with her. It was the first time Steve saw Kelly stand up to Diana, leaving them both shocked as Diana left abruptly. In the weeks that followed, the ordeal remained difficult. Claire repeatedly expressed remorse for even considering such a pact and for seeking Steve's endorsement. She was tied to tradition by her mum and hadn't thought through the consequences. Steve was in a dilemma about moving to the city for work. He could no longer delay it, yet the thought of leaving Claire alone on the island was daunting. Claire sensed his concern and suggested she could join him, even if it meant pausing her job. Their estrangement from her mum deepened. They ceased communicating, and Claire never mentioned the tradition again. After considerable thought and worry, Steve decided he had to have faith in Claire and proceed alone. Claire tried again to convince Steve she could accompany him, but he knew she was engrossed in an important marketing project and needed to concentrate. Claire promised to call daily and stay in constant contact. Steve arrived in London by ferry, taxi, train, and subway, which exhausted him. He collapsed on his hotel bed by 9 p.m., calling Claire, who answered immediately. They talked about his travel and the city's changes in a long conversation. London was alive with new constructions. After the call, Steve quickly fell asleep, tired. He had been through several stressful work days, but being away from the island helped him clear his thoughts. He began to reconsider his relationship with Claire and mentally revisited some of their discussions. The man, once eager to maintain a bond with a younger man, now felt as distant from his wife as he did from the nurturing mother of his kids. He believed Diana had too much influence over her and was relieved about their dispute. Diana had overstepped, and he hoped that was the last of it. However, he found it difficult to grasp Claire's actions and her belief that their current situation wouldn't affect their relationship, which continued to disturb him. Steve was abruptly taken back to the memory of the trees that had been set on his land the previous spring. Over the last year, Claire had made several trips to the island. Wondering about the identity of the person who had planted these trees evoked a feeling of dread in him. Maybe her strong defense this time was an attempt to justify her past actions. He dialed Claire's number, and she swiftly picked up again. Steve initiated the conversation. "Isn't there an older brother of Jake Fraser?" After a brief silence, Claire casually replied, "I think so." "Our families go way back." "Yes, Steve, he has a sibling named Glenn." After another pause, she softly continued, "Yes, and he was the one who planted the trees last year." Silence ensued. Steve continued, "And for what did Glenn Fraser do this?" Claire broke out of her daydream. "Just for payment." "Steve, they're the only family on the island in the landscaping business. So you aren't accommodating Jake Fraser at the moment, are you?" Claire let out a sigh. "No, Steve, I'm not accommodating anyone, and you have to overcome this jealousy." Before she could say more, Steve hung up. Claire kept calling, but Steve disregarded them. He needed time to reflect. He answered her call on Friday morning, surprising Claire. "I'm relieved you picked up. I was getting anxious," she expressed. "Indeed," was Steve's sole response. "Remember, I love you more than anything. When will you return tomorrow? Can we talk about it?" The tranquility in Steve's voice concerned Claire. "I won't be coming back. I'll remain here a bit longer." Claire grew worried. "Don't make this decision. "We must address this now," Steve answered again in a calm yet unsettling tone. "Indeed, yet you didn't rush to London for it and only reached out in the daytime. I assume your evenings were well occupied. Please, Steve, come back. I'm not guilty. It's just your suspicion. Just return and we'll sort everything out." 5 days later, Steve was on his way back to the island by ferry. Upon reaching the home, Claire was waiting to welcome him with Diana. It appeared the news had also reached her. Claire tried to hug and kiss him, but Steve kept his distance. Claire began to cry, and Diana looked visibly upset. "Why are you here, Diana? This issue is between Claire and me alone. Should I take it that you two have always agreed on everything?" Before Diana could answer, Claire explained, "We had a disagreement, but when you didn't come back, I needed someone, and you weren't here." Steve frowned. "I find it hard to believe my mother-in-law would make peace with someone unless it suited her interests. Given her push for a settlement, I doubt she would compromise. I guess you never really argued, and it was all for show." Claire's eyes grew wide. "Everything is getting out of hand, Steve. I'm not to blame," Steve countered. "So the two of you chose to invent and hide this because I wouldn't have consented to it." The argument went in circles. Steve was convinced Claire had been dishonest, but she denied all allegations. Eventually, he withdrew to the guest bedroom, leaving Claire and Diana alone. The next day, Steve was set to visit his father-in-law, Bill Taylor, knowing the conversation would be difficult. They always shared a cordial relationship, and Bill welcomed him with a warm handshake, noting he had been expecting Steve's visit. They talked about traditions and Bill's perspectives. Bill shared that roughly 20 years ago, Diana had a brief fling with John Fraser. He disapproved, yet it brought back memories of a night he had greatly enjoyed at 18. Steve cautiously mentioned Diana's admission of several fleeting affairs, asking if Bill found it believable. Bill was saddened but confessed he had suspicions there was more to the narrative, and his time spent on a commercial fishing trip had provided ample opportunities. Steve questioned if Bill was aware of his daughter's behavior. Bill acknowledged that Diana and Claire were very close but had tried to protect him from the reality. A week before Steve's trip to London, they hinted at having a plan. Claire sat at the kitchen table, looking away from Steve. "I can't bear the thought of my dad divorcing my mum, and we're the cause," she lamented. Diana had made up her mind your father would never support such deceit and lies. She persists in her refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing, even as John Fraser has admitted the truth, accompanied by others. In the ensuing silence, Claire murmured, "I get it, and it's for that reason I feel compelled to reveal something to you." Steve remained quiet. "Forgive me, Steve, but I had made arrangements with Jake." The expected upheaval Claire had braced for did not materialize, and similarly with Glenn Fraser last year, Claire said in a low voice. Steve was at a loss for words, unable to respond. "Please, Steve, don't let this change what we have. We've enjoyed 22 beautiful years together. How can this be seen as altering everything? I'm truly sorry, Steve. I believed it was necessary for fulfilling obligations to our family." Steve was enraged. "Absurd. Your actions were motivated by the desire for an affair. I gave in to the temptation and found it gratifying enough to repeat. It wasn't about that. It was about obligation, a familial duty." Claire hesitated, knowing she was navigating precarious territory. It was mere physicality, unlike what we share, devoid of love. It occurred once, it won't happen again. Yet this was not an isolated incident. You became involved with both your brothers as they neared 18, which makes you nothing but. Claire cringed at Steve's cutting remarks. "I'm not that kind of person. I was adhering to a tradition, helping young men transition into adulthood. That was the extent of it." They were grateful. Claire immediately regretted her words. Steve retorted, "Oh, they must have been exceedingly grateful. You say it happened just once, but how many times did it really happen? You've raised them, so tell me, for an 18-year-old eager to impress, and given the opportunity for an evening and the entire night, it must have been at least 5 times a day, so possibly 35 times a week. It's unlikely it was just once." Claire had no counter. Glenn and Jake were indeed eager to impress. Although initially some patience was required, there was hardly any need for instruction. She took pleasure in their vibrant, healthy bodies, just as her mother had predicted. The encounters were exhilarating. She especially enjoyed tantalizing each of them with peeks at her stockings or a hint of her cleavage, fully aware she would yield to them completely later that night. At one point, Jake even declared his love for her. It was the only time she contemplated the potential impact of such a week on her regular life, and the marriage she valued so deeply, promptly clarifying the reality of their connection to Jake. Steve continued, "And what does an 18-year-old really need these days? I'm sure they've been observing you right from the beginning and you couldn't resist, could you?" Claire cried. "It's not what you think. It was meant as a harmless adventure, purely physical. I realize it wounds your ego, but my heart still belongs to you, and it's you who completes me." Steve's anger escalated. "This goes beyond ego and touches on loyalty and vows. What about the promises we made? Does tradition justify breaching them? It's not about ego when one is betrayed by their life partner. And for what? Not for something meaningful or dire, but for a tradition of casual encounters with young men." Claire's face flushed. "I understand your anger and pain, but we're strong enough to get past this. After Glenn, you noticed nothing amiss, and we grew closer. I believed it would be the same with Jake. I was unaware because I had unconditional faith in the woman I loved. Trust me, it won't happen again. Am I to trust that? You must be jesting." Steve raised his voice in disbelief. "You can. Trust me, I assure you. My remorse for causing you distress is genuine. Consider the wonderful life we still have ahead of us. We can return to the way things were. Did you think about our wonderful life while orchestrating all this, laying down?" "No, I would never have proceeded if I had considered the consequences. I never intended to harm you, but I did, and for that I am profoundly sorry." "And what do you think came of it?" Claire was speechless. "It's clear you don't understand my feelings. You've torn apart my heart and soul. How can you possibly repair this with those words?" Steve stormed out, determined not to act on his impulse to regret. He continued walking, trying to clear his head, though the beauty of the evening's sunset offered little solace. As he turned back towards the village, he was surprised to run into Elder Helen Brown. Steve could barely manage a nod in her direction. Helen grinned, indicating that their encounter was not by chance. She had observed Steve heading toward the trail that leads to the cliff and realized she could meet him on his way back. Helen proposed they rest on a stone bench, where she gently asked if Steve would be willing to discuss his current predicament. Finding no reason to withhold, he revealed all details to her. Speaking out did not lessen the weight of his troubles. Helen gave her undivided attention as he spoke. He hesitated to mention Diana's suggestion that an elder should become intimate with him so Claire could adhere to her responsibilities, but he suspected Helen played a part in this matter and thus shared it with her. After he concluded, Helen remained quiet for an extended time before saying, "Steve, such a suggestion was never made by me. Diana did not present or propose any such agreement to me or to Maura. We would not entertain such an idea. My guess is that Diana was trying to persuade you into agreeing to extramarital intimacy to justify their plotted scheme." Steve found her response perplexing. Helen continued, "Another thing, Steve. These practices have largely disappeared for years, and when they existed, it was only for one night, not an entire week. The week-long obligations were typically household or agricultural work, culminating in a single night's commitment. It's possible that Melissa, Diana, and Susan took matters into their own hands, reacting to the situation." Every time Steve began to come to terms with his spouse's actions, he was met with another revelation. Helen then explained she would speak with Maura and take necessary steps to ensure Diana would be stripped of her elder status. To her knowledge, such an incident was unprecedented and would surely lead to a scandal, yet Diana's actions were indefensible today. Elders are meant to be involved in community affairs and support the island's inhabitants. Helen looked at Steve. "Your plans?" Steve gave a shrug. "I can't force her to realize the impact of her actions, but I hope she could empathize with my current feelings." They fell silent until Steve noticed a subtle smile on Helen's face. "Your thoughts?" Helen's smile widened as she offered, "How about you stay with me for a week? Seriously, let's keep Claire and Diana in the dark about this. We'll say I willingly accepted the proposal on my behalf as an elder, so you can give Claire a taste of her own medicine while I get to irritate Diana for dragging me into this situation." Steve was excited by the suggestion, but worried. "But wouldn't this harm your reputation?" "I am still married, and everyone will think," Helen interrupted. "Firstly, I'm not worried about public opinion, and secondly, it's unfortunate, but nearly everyone on the island knows about your situation, Steve." The realization hit Steve hard, yet it quickly turned into an agreeable plan he discussed with Helen. "Honestly, I'd love to plant trees for you. This will surely make Claire and Diana reconsider. They laughed together and quickly came to a decision. Steve returned home to pack his things swiftly. He informed Claire that after some thought he decided to accept her mother's kind offer regarding the island's elder, and given the circumstances, spending a week with another lady was completely justified. He left with Claire in tears, begging him not to go. His time with Helen was unexpectedly enjoyable. She was delightful company and an excellent cook. During the house renovation, Steve managed to plant some trees in the garden. They discussed Steve's ordeal, hoping the week would offer Claire some insight into his feelings. Unless he saw more understanding from her regarding her actions, a reconciliation seemed far off. Keeping his word, he and Helen never became physically intimate, though they came close a few times, not due to a lack of interest. Shortly after, Claire confronted Helen in the village shop, accusing her of engaging in an affair with her spouse. With a serene smile, Helen replied, "My dear Claire, you ought to realize this is not an affair but a mutual agreement, which will not impinge upon your marital life." Claire recognized these words as her own from Helen's response, yet insisted, "This is unacceptable, he is my spouse." Helen replied with tranquility, "In fact, I am simply adhering to the arrangement made by your mother on my behalf. It's ultimately up to Steve, and I must honor the tradition. It could have been Diane instead. Consider yourself fortunate. Rest assured, I will ensure his return to you, though he may be a bit fatigued." Claire was left shocked. You ancient," Helen responded calmly. "It seems that term fits someone who betrayed her faithful spouse with 2 young lovers." With those words, Helen departed, leaving Claire without words as the store's patrons observed. The following morning, a distraught Claire attempted to smash Helen's door, only for Steve to open it. "Steve, I beg you, forgive me in return. I'm just mimicking your actions. Why are you disturbed by this?" she begged. "Because, as you've stated, this shouldn't upset us." "I never realized it's simply malicious," the thought of you with her torments me, Steve said. "Ah, that sounds familiar. Now, you understand my situation," closing the door abruptly. When Steve came back a week later, he found Claire calmer. "I'm ready to forgive you, though it's hard to accept what you've done. Your feelings are your own perspective. You haven't lived through the lies and deception our entire relationship was built on. These deceptions," Claire argued. "We are still the same people, part of the same relationship, the same bond that drove you to others. That bond you broke, and I'm still puzzled by your reasons. Is your dissatisfaction with me that great? It wasn't about boredom or dissatisfaction with you. If we can't return to the past, we can start anew. Let's look forward to fulfilling our retirement dreams together, travels, time with grandchildren. We can still make it happen. We love each other despite everything. It's not too late. Steve, I'll prove my love to you in every way." Steve stayed, occupying the guest bedroom, wrestling with dreadful thoughts about his future if he left Claire. He wavered between viewing his future as a failure or a void. Staying seemed easier, and his love for Claire remained. Pondering the likelihood of Claire's actions repeating was challenging. The island held beauty, and he had dreamt of exploring it, having spent years planning these adventures with Claire. The idea of giving it all up was daunting. Claire reflected on the sequence of events leading to this juncture, finding it utterly bewildering. When her mother proposed an agreement, she refused, yet Diana persisted for months. Then, at a social function, she met Glenn Fraser, who was notably handsome and exceedingly courteous. They connected after dancing at several gatherings. Diana recounted her escapades, describing them as thrilling adventures rather than infidelities, seeing them as part of a tradition. Knowing Steve wouldn't agree, Claire hid it all. Unbeknownst to him, it would cause no harm. Her time with Glenn was splendid. He spent his days reforesting and his evenings with her. Initially shy, he became an attentive lover, blending his physical presence with patience and finesse. For Claire, this was an empowering experience, rejuvenating her sense of femininity lost during the long span of maternity. Was this tradition or just secret affairs, as Steve argued? She had to admit it was both, but wasn't she entitled to some joy after 22 years of mothering and fidelity? She was convinced it had not jeopardized her marriage with Steve. Their relationship seemed stronger, her affection for him deepened, and their physical intimacy increased following that week. Jake appeared even more enticing, and she contemplated bringing him closer. Steve, ever observant, unearthed the tradition, and Aunt Melissa's diaries were blamed for exposing it all. Claire and her mother tried to justify it to Steve, yet he remained unconvinced. In hindsight, her decision to deceive was her most significant misstep. Still, she believed reconciliation with Steve was possible once the initial shock subsided. She just needed to remind him of their cherished memories and shared aspirations. He, too, would likely wish to stay together for their daughters and future grandchildren, a thought that might bolster her argument. To Steve's surprise, his daughters landed on the island 2 days ahead of schedule. Nicole wasted no time in reprimanding Steve for his severe attitude towards her mother, pointing out that the notion of them splitting up was ridiculous. Michelle seemed to be holding off, waiting for more information. Steve caught a fleeting smirk on Claire's face. Had he not seen through her lies and deception over the years? It seemed she thought he would keep silent about their mother's actions to their daughters, protecting them as he had always done. Steve had no more doubts, but Claire was deeply mistaken. In a tone his daughters barely remembered, Steve spoke up. "Your mother has been engaging in affairs for 2 weeks with people younger than both of you. She apparently fails to understand that such behavior is unacceptable to me." Claire quickly denied this, insisting that Steve had misunderstood and that the individuals were simply doing landscaping work. Steve admitted she sounded convincing, almost swaying him too. The daughters felt that something was wrong, but the idea their father proposed seemed too far-fetched. Perhaps he was losing his grasp on reality. Steve might agree with that assessment, yet he suggested they contact Grandpa Bill or the village elders to verify the facts. Claire collapsed, or more accurately, pretended to. It was hardly compelling. They all looked on in shock, expecting a similarly unconvincing justification. Steve looked at her with scorn. "I can no longer trust you. It's over, there's no going back or forward. Think of how you'll look at yourself in the mirror, knowing you've betrayed me. And how will I face myself if I let this go? We depend on each other, Steve. We've always supported each other, making each other stronger. I'm the one for you, and deep down you know it. Don't throw away your life to punish me. I can take it, Claire, but I won't let you destroy me. I'll start anew. We must all live with our decisions and remain true to ourselves. You'll have to live with your infidelity, deceit, and the loss of what we shared. I'll live with leaving the woman I love, but you're not who I thought you were, not the kind and loving person I fell in love with. I wish I could have her back, but not you." Steve left the island with his daughters and decided to rent an apartment closer to their university. The girls were shocked by the actions of their mother and grandmother. He never looked back. His last act was to burn down the trees in the orchard. Claire observed the flickering flames, tears rolling down her cheeks. Bill helped Steve sell the estate since Claire couldn't afford its maintenance. The divorces of Diana and Claire caused a stir and determined the fate of their remaining legacy. Diana was the first to lose her position as an elder. Both she and Claire were ostracized. No woman would trust or befriend them. Yet they stubbornly remained on their island. A few months later, Helen Brown resigned as an elder. Islanders noticed she divided her time between the island and another place. She eventually only visited for a few weeks each year. Upon questioning, she stated she lived with her relatives near a place called Durham. Make sure to follow our channel so you won't be cheated on by your partner, and don't miss the next story, as it promises to overshadow this one. If you're under 18, think carefully before tuning into the next tale.